My name is Jeff Slipka, and today I'm going to try and answer the question for you: how do I minimize, reduce, or eliminate environmental liability in construction contracts? First, there's a variety of different contractual terms and provisions that can be included in construction contracts to reduce, minimize, and even eliminate environmental liability for contractors. In owner-generated contracts, for instance, the most obvious are indemnity provisions, disclosure statements, pre-existing contamination clauses, and change in condition provisions. Similar to typical indemnity provisions, environmental indemnity provisions are intended to prevent the innocent party from suffering the financial consequences of known or unknown pre-existing environmental conditions that it did not cause. This is seen in many contracts, all different types of contracts, purchase sale agreements, purchase orders, but mostly in construction contracts. The provision typically establishes that the indemnitor will defend and hold harmless the indemnity from any incident, condition, claims, losses, essentially any liability arising from environmental contamination that existed prior to the date of sale or for construction contractors prior to work being performed. There are many versions of environmental indemnity provisions. Some require defense to be provided while others may not. Some even extend to any and all liability, except for sole or gross negligence or willful misconduct of the indemnity. These indemnity agreements can be as expansive or as restrictive as both parties agree, and are based on initial environmental studies or information on the property or the construction project site. The downside to most provisions is that generally they will not extend to the work caused by the contractor as they are working in contaminated areas. For example, if you had a contractor who exacerbated the extent of contamination without the proper wording in the contract, protection for that spreading of the pre-existing contamination may be limited at best or even non-existent, so no protection. In those cases, it may be smart to consider what's called the pre-existing contamination clause. A pre-existing contamination provision is most commonly seen in construction contracts when there is a threat of contamination or contamination is actually known. Pre-existing contamination clauses are typically written to address particular pre-existing contaminants found in the environment through the assessment process, phase 1s, phase 2s, etc. However, they can also be written to apply much more broadly than typical indemnities and extend to liability that arises out of or is related to contamination that exists on the project site. So, any liability arising out of the disturbance or the exacerbation of that contamination would remain with the owner. Another important provision is disclosure of environmental information provision, or disclosure of environmental information. Generally speaking, disclosure statements must specifically provide information about the environmental condition of the site and any structures that may be on that property or the project site. Such information should include the obvious, right? Like information on underground storage tanks, asbestos-containing material, lead, PCBs, things of that sort, and any other general environmental issues that are brought up in the assessment process. There should also be a complete detail relating to permits and subsequent violations, discharges, and fines pertaining to hazardous substances used at that site if it was or is an operating site. So you could look into the compliance history for that operating site to determine if there was anything ever disposed of on that property. The unwillingness of the owner or the seller to release this information should not be a deterrent to obtaining environmental information. There's a tremendous amount of information at our fingertips. Volumes of environmental data are offered through a vast array of internet sites. For instance, a simple 5-minute search may offer environmental information for a bid or on bid for the redevelopment of a site that is actually a Superfund site. It may contain leaking underground storage tanks and all different types of hazardous constituents. While it may not change the decision to bid on the project, the environmental information would certainly change the scope of that bid, the cost of that bid, or how you as the contractor approach that project or that contract. Note that caution must be exercised when performing these internet searches, of course, right? it is always prudent to stick to sites produced, maintained, and updated by reputable organizations, such as the federal government or state governments, most specifically the US EPA. Through a zip code search, you can find the names of federally regulated facilities with compliance issues or permit violations, as well as information on all the MPL sites or Superfund sites across the country. Details like these can be obtained in seconds and free of charge. I've used them in the past myself. The logic here, once the contamination is identified, it can be addressed and discussed above. The responsibility of pre-existing contamination should remain with the owner of such contamination, period. Moving on, and the last provision that can help minimize environmental liability is a change in condition provision. Construction contracts typically contain a change in condition provision, right? A change in condition provision specific to environmental conditions or contamination should also be contemplated. Many times contamination is found during the course of work. For example, an excavation contractor locates a leaking underground storage tank that no one even expected. No assessment brought it up. It was installed, it wasn't recorded, so therefore it wasn't found. Or a drywall contractor finds asbestos when they're drilling through existing walls and things of that sort in the hospital or any other type of property, you name it. Does the contract spell out the responsibilities of each party? That's a question. Will the contractor be responsible to remediate or remove newly discovered contamination? Is the owner responsible? Are change orders warranted? What about the stoppage of work as a result of the contamination? Who pays for that delay? A change in condition clause can allow for the owner and the contractor to ensure proper procedures are followed in the event problems are encountered. General response procedures on the part of both parties, right, should be spelled out so that each one knows how to respond in event of a problem in order to solidify everyone's response, just making sure everybody's on the same page. However, this clause should also be general enough to apply to a myriad of unexpected environmental conditions. One more thing before we leave, and that's about subcontract agreements. I have to just say this. Aside from the indemnity provisions, it can be beneficial to require subcontractors to evidence CPL insurance on any type of work. The old argument that contractors' pollution liability is too expensive is outdated today. There's close to 50 carriers offering CPL coverage, and many offer coverage with minimum premiums of around $1,000 for $1 million limit. Now, keep in mind, it's not going to be the expansive coverage that you may get or may have to pay a little bit more for, but it's going to address the basic pollution liability. I hope you enjoyed the couple of minutes that we spent on contracts and how to minimize liability through construction contracts. For topics like this and other topics, please contact one of your RTECP consultants today. Thanks.